Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined once again by Charlie Araujo, back from a 2-week, break.
I am back. I missed being on the show. It was sort of weird not having any reason to make sure I stayed up on everything, but it was a good reason. I mean, it was the right thing to do. Moving is never fun, and man, this one sort of kicked my rear end. So I definitely needed the 2 weeks off of not having to worry about staying up on everything because, as always, it is just this blistering pace, and it's really difficult to keep track of all of it. So I was glad to take the time, but I'm definitely even more glad to be back. Although I'm not glad about the timing because, of course, what are we going to spend most of the show talking about, or at least half the show? Security, because it's RSA, or it was RSA week
Favorite.
last week. Oh my God, I hate security, but it's obviously a huge important deal to any enterprise IT function, and arguably one of the largest conferences in the world around enterprise
Yes.
IT. I haven't actually covered RSA for years, mostly because I went, it's probably 8 years ago that I covered it the last time. And I mean, it just made my brain hurt. But you were brave this year and decided to head to RSA. So I'm gonna sort of follow along. Like I'll wear the CIO hat today, and I'll ask you some questions and pepper with like, does this really matter? But I think we're gonna have to get the digest from the floor of the RSA from you. So take it
Yeah.
away.
So I went to RSA partially because it's just in my backyard, and it was a 20-minute trip to go over there and take a look. And I wanted to see two things that there are two things that I was really interested in. First was to see how much AI washing and AI hype there would be at RSA. I knew there would be a lot, but I wanted to see it was a lot, or even more than that. And the other one was just because you all know that I love government stuff. I wanted to see the government security relationship and how that was reflected at RSA this year, because there were some last minute exits, let's say, due to the thinning of the federal government that has been happening in the past couple of months. Yeah, so there are some interesting stories that happened there. But before I get into the deeper stuff, one of my favorite things is that they were talking about is uh, in the first half of this year, in the beginning of this year, we've been talking. The Fortune 500 has really noticed that there have been a lot of North Koreans trying to sneak into security departments and IT departments, especially in Fortune 500 companies. And they get in because, frankly, they get candidates who are very technically skilled, and they offer to be remote employees. They offer to work at a low price, and they sneak in. And once they get in, they act like spies. So this was
I,
actually a
I read
topic.
these
Yeah.
I read these articles you sent, and they were like shocking to me. I mean, my brain sort of was exploding in reading through these for any number of reasons. I mean, the first that I think it's hilarious that part of the job, of course, because North Korea is so encumbered, that part of the job is just to make money, just to collect the salary. Um, but then, of course, they're doing this corporate espionage and hiring unwitting, like housewives from the Midwest that are sort of down in their luck to act as their. It sounds like they start unwitting and then eventually they sort of figure it out, but the money's too good for them to pass it up, where they're running these
Mhm.
laptop farms and stuff. I mean, just bewildering. And then the other half of this, how do you have an employee and miss this, right? Because they're very clearly not coming across as who they are, and I'm sure we're going to post these links, but I highly encourage you, if you're a CIO, you absolutely need to be reading these articles and sort of alerting your hiring staff to make sure you're watching out for these signs, because they're obviously putting them in roles that are typically very heads down, where you're not having a lot of human sort of interaction, and then kind of get away with this, and it's scary stuff. It's like just mind blowing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm Korean, so the last thing I want is racism against Koreans. But if you've got somebody who's like applying as Brian Sutherfield, and then they show up and they have trouble speaking English and don't answer to Brian, like something's really weird with this interview, and maybe you shouldn't be hiring this person, no matter how good they look on paper and what they're able to answer in their technical interview.
Well, and I love that this article that you sent. Their little fail-safe way of just making sure is to just throw in this random question about um, uh,
Kim Jong-un.
thank you, yes, and is it
Yeah.
how fat is he or something, because they refuse to answer so that they're gone. And
Yeah,
so it's like,
you can't say anything bad about our dear leader. So even on that phone call, which is probably tapped to begin with.
just wild, but it does show. And I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why I dislike covering security so much. It's an entire discipline. It requires, and it's one of the things that is so difficult for enterprise IT organizations, is that as we finally achieved our goal, right, as a IT or tech leader, the goal has always been for IT to sort of have a seat at the table, to be so critical and important to the enterprise that you had to be addressing this from this kind of strategic layer. And we've largely achieved that, right? It is now central to everything the enterprise does. But what that has really created is this massive risk plane. And this is just a classic example of something that you wouldn't, when you think about security, this isn't where your head goes. And yet, such a very real concern. So yeah, mind blowing stuff, and definitely should read the article. But what else at the RSA just maybe more conventionally stood out at you?
Yeah, I'm gonna pass over this one because there's not a real reason to dig too far into it. But one of the things that has really stood out at RSA is how the federal government obviously wants to recruit cybersecurity experts, and they usually are all over RSA. You've got the NSA talking about the state of the hack, which is probably next to the keynote, the most popular talk at RSA. It is usually a standing room only event where the NSA literally talks about the biggest security issues of the past year. This year, that State of the Hack talk was canceled with very little notice. I would say in mid-January, we got announcements that this was not going to happen. I guess there were some government cuts. And we had a very political keynote from Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, uh, previously, South Dakota governor or whatever. And it's a little odd to see such a politicized talk coming from the federal government rather than the cybersecurity experts that they typically have.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. Well, it speaks volumes, but I think more than anything, it speaks to sort of this dangerous confluence of this intersection of what's happening, right? I mean, and it's not just with security, and we don't need to dive into it, but I think across a lot of our what have heretofore been independent agencies that were sort of tasked with making sure that the government and really vis-a-vis the government, the mechanisms of the country functioned sort of without regard to the political standing of which administration was in office. And frankly, it was those factors that drove the stability of why people invest in the US, why we attracted the best talent, why we attracted the biggest companies. And I think this is just another sign of this is maybe the greatest risk factor around all of this, is that if the U.S. is not seen at the forefront of cybersecurity, I mean, it's an arms race. And while I don't cover security and don't follow it, that doesn't mean I don't understand the absolute dire criticality and importance of it. And so I think it's a disappointing evolution of it, because I'm also not convinced that this was the people got laid off, right? That I think this was a conscious decision on behalf of the administration of how they wanted to approach it. And I think that that's a sort of a dangerous sign. But I guess we will see. I'm hoping it's a blip. I'm hoping that they will get bored, because for good or for bad, it's a very technical area, and they'll kind of get bored, and this will sort of get back to normal. But because it's tough no matter what. I mean, you sent the announcements list. It was 5 separate websites, right? Web pages
Yes.
full of all these announcements. It is just so much to cover. That we just need people that this is all they're doing, where there's just no room for the politics in it. But all that aside, what were I mean, I'm curious the role of AI that you saw on the floor. Was it everywhere? I mean, you talked about that, was there AI hype and AI washing everywhere? Did you see any real solutions? I mean, what was your take on how this is all
Yeah,
playing?
so it's funny because we're going to talk about this later on in the show as well. But basically, you could not shake a stick without hitting a booth talking about their AI agent. Everybody wanted to talk about their AI agent, which is really just a delivery mechanism for doing what you've already been doing. And I honestly wonder how useful it is for a lot of security tasks where you are already an expert in cybersecurity if you're doing this task in the first place. So how much do you need the user interface to be dumbed down? I I'm really wondering how useful a lot of these agents will be. I think the more useful aspects are the ones that we're focusing on some sort of AI governance or some sort of injection protection for
Well, it's
protecting
interesting
data.
because there's sort of two parts to this landscape, right? There's one, a security company leveraging AI to simplify its own tool or to leverage it, within its own tool. And then there's security being applied to AI within the
Right.
enterprise. And so on the first one, which is where you started, it is interesting because to me, there's really only, maybe not only, but there's two right off the cuff, two use cases that sort of strike, right? The first is what I call that using AI as an abstraction layer. To your
Yep.
point, right? Taking away a very complex item and simplifying it so that somebody can simply chat with an AI agent or a bot, and it's actually going to go and handle this, and they don't have to know the process or the technicalities or whatever, right? But one of the things that's interesting is to your point is with security, it's almost always all about the details. So I'm not saying I can't see a use case. I mean, sort of like coding, right? There's a very powerful use case with AI and coding to speed up what are often mundane, routine, repeatable tasks. And I could see the same sort of focus. But
Like
I think
patching.
that
Yeah. Mhm.
I'm sorry?
Like patching, for instance.
Yeah, yeah, so
Mhm.
I can see where that part makes sense. And then the other use cases, which I guess is sort of related, it would be like the automation aspects of it, of handling a routine set of, maybe complex tasks. But I agree with you. I think I think you'd be hard pressed to not be asking yourself if you're a security company how you could apply AI and agents to do this. But on the other hand, it's probably one of the areas that because one of the things I talk about is right now everyone's trying to de-risk. Well, this is
Mhm.
the exact antithesis of de-risking, right? This is the bet your business kind of stuff. And so I bet we're seeing some hesitancy of using it in some of these areas, except for these very sort of like patching, right? Low bandwidth sort of, or high bandwidth, low risk sort of things.
Yeah. And so I think the progress is interesting to watch. I will say that one product in particular kind of got my attention uh, in a way a negative way. Like the Palo
Mhm.
Alto networks, obviously one of the big security players, they announced their Prisma product, which said that they would basically protect everything end to end that is agentic. And to me, that sounds like there's a lot of room for failure here, especially since there's a lot of stuff in the middle in that is agentic right now where nobody can, I don't think anybody can honestly say they know how to secure it 100%.
I don't understand how this made it through a review, right? Because
Mhm.
I'll read it because you pointed this one out, so I read through this. Palo Alto Networks has unveiled Prism Air as an AI security platform designed to secure every AI app, agent, model, and data set across the enterprise, the entire enterprise. It's like, okay, I think you'd be hard pressed to even define what that means right now, let alone
Mhm.
actually execute on it. So yeah, it's one of those things where it's like that's just making a promise. There's no way they can possibly deliver on. At least not. I don't know if anyone's ever going to be able to truly deliver on it. It's one of those things, right? The only way they can do that would be not doing it effectively because there's just so much nuance, so much so many layers of complexity. But
Right.
yeah, that was sort of fascinating and interesting, like you said, coming from a very well regarded company. So that's sort of interesting.
Yeah, I don't mind taking a platform approach for a lot of types of solutions, but it is hard for me to imagine an AI security approach that isn't best in breed and piecemeal at this point, just because there are so many pieces to take a look at right now.
Did you go to their booth and see what they were actually doing?
I saw bits and pieces. I had trouble they did not have enough time to walk through the product in a standard way. And so I just got to see little bits and pieces.
And how would you see the entire thing anyway when it's everything, right? I mean, it's just
Literally
like
everything that happens in your IT world, yes.
all right. Well, how about more positively? Did anything stand out to you as like being, hey, this is a really interesting, novel approach, or solving a tough problem?
Yeah, I would say on the bright side, there was a relatively new company that I looked at called Equity Lab, and they had a product called AI Guardian that looks at AI agents and then matches it up with security and policies. And I see that as a very common sense approach to dealing with agents. And I'm hoping that this is I'm hoping that this is a good use case for thinking about how to align generative AI with agentic use cases.
So again, full caveat that I'm not a security guy, so maybe this isn't as unique as it seems to me on the surface. I'm gonna play like the role of a CIO who like only surface knows some of this. But what's interesting is in their thing they're talking about that it's a cryptographic certificate approach that is on silicon. That so they're talking about being partnering with Intel and NVIDIA, and at least my read on that would mean that they're literally embedding this on chip as an extra layer of validation that at runtime effectively being able to ensure it. Now, I don't fully understand exactly what that would mean or how that would work, but that what I do like about it is I think that's the risk when we're talking about AI is that the not being able to understand where things are running and is something getting like either injected or spoofed or so I do feel like that has an interesting approach. And to going back to this when you talked about it, using AI within your tool or using AI or using security to help with managing AI more broadly, this is in that latter camp. And I agree with you. I think this is where there's the Palo Alto thing notwithstanding, I think this is where the great opportunity and challenge is because organizations are going to struggle with this. And so I would be very curious to dig deeper and understand exactly what that means. And is the fact that it's embedded, does that, what does that really get you?
Yeah, I think being able to lock down resources to a greater extent from agentic tomfoolery and hacking is a good direction to go in, even if this hasn't nailed it. It at least is directionally hinting at doing the right thing rather than simply whitewashing over everything with AI.
Anything else?
um, so I did see a lot of video games on the floor.
A lot of video
Yeah,
games.
apparently RSA is now a video game arcade as well. I probably saw 15, 16 different machines. It was great to watch people playing F1 driving and what have you, but wouldn't say that's a great thing. And I also saw not just a petting zoo for dogs, but also baby goats on the floor. So the marketing,
I saw you posted.
so the marketing standard is going higher. Like your game's got to be pretty strong if you're going to be on the RSA floor.
So I saw you posted the goat, but you didn't post it. Why? Why were there goats on the floor?
Because they are the greatest of all time. So they brought goats.
That was their pitch on that, huh? Oh, okay. Well, hey, I mean, it got their attention. I think what's really tough. I mean, I went through, and like I said, it was 5 full pages full of these. You basically get a long paragraph of each announcement of what it is, and it just your eyes start glazing over by the third
Threat
page. I mean,
intelligence, threat intelligence, threat intelligence, threat
it's
intelligence.
so tough. Um, well, hey, I think it's interesting and it is what it is as far as trying to get your head around it. It speaks to how great a challenge is, and it speaks to how much money there is. in addressing it. But all right, well, before we move on, anything else from RSA that you felt, if you're an enterprise IT leader, that you felt, hey, they really needed to kind of hear this?
Honestly, I did not get any other big messages out of it this year. There really was an amazing focus on agentic AI. It was very hard to get even standard messages around endpoint security or firewall or anything that is considered kind of commoditized at this point. Nobody would even talk about it.
Well, and it's as we're going to talk about later in the show. I mean, part of the challenge remains is that this whole area is still so new. We don't even have reliable definitions of what the heck it means. So it's pretty hard to secure something when we can't even agree on what to call it. But
Yeah.
we'll get to that going. So one other related piece of industry news related insofar that it's touched on security is that Microsoft actually announced that they are going passwordless by default. Now they adopted passkeys much like Apple and others have quite some time ago, but you sort of were given the option. I think for most major players, there's still the option. I think the average user slash consumer still doesn't understand passkeys, although they're using them, they probably just don't know it. So this is significant because for the first time, Microsoft is actually by default not requesting or requiring a password. And I've been a fan of passkey and non-password based approaches for quite some time. The data is pretty solid that passwords are one of the most vulnerable approaches to authentication. They're, most people do a really poor job of managing them and creating difficult passwords. Companies have abused it by requiring, I use very strong passwords because I use a password generator and a password vault. And it drives me insane that, companies require me to change what is already a very strong password, and it just adds all this overhead. So there's like all these complications. And so, passkey or alternative forms of authentication have a lot of potential to change all of that. But there's just been a real big challenge in getting uptake. And so I think this is potentially a very big step forward where we're, one of the major players. Really, if I think about from a broad consumer standpoint, it's Microsoft, it's Google, and it's Apple, right? And if we get these three where they all start doing this by default, where we sort of reprogram the world and not think in terms of passwords, then we might finally reach this post-password era that we've been talking about for a better part of 2 decades. So
yes.
I took this was a very welcomed signal for me.
Oh, it's about time. Yeah, I have a password manager. I might know 1% of my passwords, and I would be hard pressed to even say what that 1% is, because they're all strong passwords. They're all 16 characters, a mixture of letters and numbers and symbols that are, I guess, hard to hack, but also impossible to remember.
Exactly. Exactly. It's look at, I think the advent of password managers with quasi randomized passwords was, certainly like I like probably most people did prior to password managers did what we all do, I think, and that is I tried to come up with a relatively hard password, and then I used it on everything, which meant if you happened to breach it one time, you had access to the keys of the kingdom. So, the password manager helps, but it takes discipline to use it, and it creates friction and overhead. And like you said, God forbid if my password manager goes away, then
you're screwed.
So we are so long past the expiration date on passwords as an authentication method, but it's just been one of those things that's so deeply ingrained into everything that it's really hard to break free. So sort of in the grand scheme of things, minor news, but it could be very, very momentous.
It's about time.
Exactly. So sort of on that same vein of like, okay, IBM also made some news. Honestly, I'm almost surprised it made news given this, but made news because they like their counterparts at Apple and Google and Microsoft have now pledged to make a very large investment in technology in the U.S. This time to the tune of about 150 billion. And much like all of the other announcements, really not much of an announcement at all, because at least as far as I understand it, this was all spending they were pretty much were going to do anyway. It wasn't really shifting anything into the US. It's become like the game du jour to make this big announcement to make it sound like you're capitulating to the Trump administration and bringing investment and jobs back, but in fact, it's just the exact thing that they were really going to do all along. So I don't know. I don't want to be jaded about it, but did you take anything else from this announcement other than Me Too?
I honestly, my only hope here is that some of those people in Poughkeepsie and upstate New York, where IBM is doing this work, get to keep their jobs. Like, and good for them if they get to do so, because IBM is bullied into keeping these plants staffed and open and spending money. So I'm all about people doing good work. Other than that, yeah, it's hard for me to imagine IBM not spending, call it 30 billion a year on a combination of R&D and manufacturing and quantum and mainframe updates. And they're actually doing their own generative models, and I'm sure that costs money as well. There's all sorts of things they are spending money on that would totally lead to 30 billion, since I think IBM makes something like 100 billion a year. Like 30 billion is just part of their operating cost.
Well, and the reality is, I mean, IBM has always spent a lot of money and had a huge chunk of their resources in the U.S. because they do so much government work, and the government work often demands and requires it, and it just makes sense. So again, yeah. I didn't take this as any big surprise. I'm not saying it's bad. I think it's great, but I just to me, this is one of those like, hey, us too. We're investing
Yes.
here too, and it's just like okay. And I get what I would be doing the same thing if I was working over there, but. It was just like, okay, yeah, there we go. All right, so I think we're going to wrap up on some actually a couple of really interesting topics. We'll get to we always try to have a story or two that's really focused on the brass tacks of CIO. But before we get there, I think it's interesting to talk a little bit about this interesting story that you found about this AI researchers from, was it Zurich, Switzerland? Yeah, the University of Zurich.
I think, Chicago, maybe? Yeah.
And University of Chicago, is that what it was? But they were doing research, unannounced research, using a Reddit.
That one. Okay.
Subreddit. Yeah, sorry. And it was fascinating, I think, so obviously we're focused on enterprise tech, and on the surface, this isn't, right? This was, it was general research about changing behaviors or changing opinions, right? And so the idea was the subreddit that is, I guess, dedicated to people sort of putting out their position and wanting to be challenged. Mm-hmm. And these researchers using AI to put in responses, and using basically how well those responses were received as a barometer of whether or not AI is better than people at persuading people. Now, a little sidebar, we've seen previous research that wasn't done the same way, that actually showed that AI was actually better at persuading people in many cases. So this was sort of a way of what this researchers hoped as a way of testing into the wild. The challenge, of course, is that they didn't tell anybody. And of course, had they told anybody, then it wouldn't have been in the wild. It would have been a controlled experiment. So it's like, I sort of get why they wanted to approach it this way. But of course, Reddit, the users, the internet, all sort of got up in arms over what they viewed as an ethical breach here, that effectively AI was sitting here and engaging on the subreddit without their knowledge and awareness. And I have my opinion on it, but before I kind of weigh in, I'm curious if I missed any context you think is important, and what your take on this was.
So I understand that technically, from an ethical perspective, these University of Zurich researchers crossed the line in experimenting on humans and potentially manipulating them. But I also feel like social media for the past 10 to 15 years has been very AI driven anyways. And we should all assume that strangers on the internet who haven't proven themselves could very well be either trolling us with intentionally bad takes, or potentially be AI. Like, this is not a new problem. And as far as the actors go, like being manipulated by a researcher is probably not even the worst social media manipulation that I will face today?
Well, so I have I have two sort of takeaways, and then I want to bring this back to why this is, I feel like, relevant for an enterprise IT leader to think about. But I'm a fairly big Redditor. I think it's what we're called, right? I'm probably on Reddit every single day and reading through subreddits. I don't contribute a whole lot, but I'm more of a lurker, I guess. But to your point, at the end of the day, it's a social media thing. And one of the common things is you'll see people in posts where they're going, "Ah, this is clearly a bot," right? It's like there are bots all over Reddit already. So the only thing that made this really different is that it was organized by a ostensibly, legitimate organization in terms of this. It was part of this research. Um, and so, on the one hand, I sort of get it. But on the other hand, it's like, it's flipping social media. It's like, what do you, and guess what? If this AI changed your mind, then I guess you made a good argument because you changed your mind. And so it sort of proved the point. So as we've seen a lot with the whole AI space, I found this sort of a lot of to do of nothing. However, the one thing, and this goes back to where I found this relevant from a CIO perspective, I think one of the challenges that we have of applying this technology in an enterprise context is that we have a lot of risk. We have a lot at stake. And trying to ferret out what works, what doesn't, how it works, why it works, is going to be really, really challenging. And it's one of those, and I always forget the name of this paradox, but once somebody understands that it's AI, then the tenor changes, right? And so it's one of the battles, one of the things that I feel is, I don't know if you've noticed this, that I think is developing, in that increasingly I'm seeing what are clearly AI bots, or at least clearly to me, AI bots, not self-identifying as AI. And I've actually had it a couple of times where I'm like interacting and then I like, oh, I didn't realize you're AI. I need to talk to somebody, right? And I think this is going to be an ongoing challenge for CIOs and enterprises in general as to, do we in fact owe the people we're interacting with an explanation or a definition that they're interacting with an AI or not? There's all this talk about AI agents, and we'll talk a little bit more about the hype, but of taking on human personas, and do we owe that? And I think it's a really interesting question that's going to become more and more difficult to answer over time as the capabilities increase, as we deploy them more consistently. And so it was just, to me, it was just a bit of a thought experiment. And I was quite fascinated by the very visceral reaction on this group. So
yeah, but I think more than just as a thought experiment, when I see press releases by Zendesk or NICE or Five9, anybody involved in customer experience or help desk or contact center, this is exactly the type of stuff they're talking about, being able to automate tier one interactions on the help desk, being able to answer basic frequently asked questions, and being able to do it with a friendly voice in real time and with very questionable methods of identifying who is actually providing that answer. It very much varies from vendor to vendor. So I think that is definitely something we're going to run into. I would say that from a scientific perspective, not necessarily from my enterprise business perspective, I actually think it is important to have some sort of measure of how much more persuasive AI is than an average person, because we know that AI, without tweaking, tends to be sociopathically confident. Like, that's one of the things we noticed about GPT when it started becoming popular, that it might give you the wrong answer, but it was sure very confident about giving you that wrong answer, 100% no doubt. And then people would be surprised when it would, it would tell you, oh, the sky is purple. And then you would write back, is the sky really purple? I thought it was blue. And it says, oh, you're right. Yes, it is absolutely blue. It's like, whatever it says, it is 100% committed. And that commitment leads to persuasiveness.
yeah, no, I think from a purely ethical standpoint, what they would have been well served to do is find a willing subreddit or to create their own, where they acknowledge that, hey, the answers may be AI, may not be, and that way. And I think the other thing that got them into trouble, frankly, was that it wasn't just like they unleashed a bot here and let it sort of do its thing. The researchers themselves were attempting to infer things like race and gender from posts and sort of then seeding the AI with that. And that was now starting to get a little dicey. So I mean, there are definitely some issues with it, but I do think it's a larger issue that you're going to have to address and understand the implications and understand the reaction that you may get if you're not careful in how you deploy it. Which leads then to sort of the next question. It's like, well, where do you deploy it? And you forwarded another article, this one from Computer World, talking about the fact that all the hype aside, AI may in fact not be delivering all this productivity. Now, I will say I question the articles a little bit, the veracity of it, because it cites some pretty cagey sources in here. I mean, for instance, there's this quote. It says, "The measured value of generative AI in the workplace so far has been quite mixed," at Hyoun Park, CEO and chief analyst of Amalgam Insights. I mean, if they're quoting you, how good of an article can it be, really?
Very true. Very suspect. There are other articles that did cover this story as well, but I understand why we're not believing me. But hopefully, we can believe economists Anders Humlum and Emilie Vestergaard, who did look at who surveyed the impact of generative AI. I would add not agentic AI. This is a look at generative AI from last year, and found that at least in Denmark, it had very little impact on wages or job retention. So a lot of talk about how generative AI was going to lead to productivity and changes and all of this, and it didn't actually happen. And I don't think that should be a huge surprise to us, knowing what we know now, that there's an extra layer of alignment that really needs to be in place from a workflow and automation perspective to make generative AI truly useful in the enterprise.
Yeah, no, and I think your points in the article were well taken, and I think that what this speaks to in general is that we're, again, as we've said ad nauseum on this show, we're at the early stages of this, and it's a mix of, I think, an intersection of three things, right? One is that the technology is still very early. It's got some very rough edges. It doesn't always deliver as much as we would hope, and therefore it ends up sort of it's sort of like a gambling at the casino. You get some wins and then you lose some money back to the house, and you maybe come out just a little bit ahead, right? So you have that sort of aspect of it. I think the second aspect is you've got the fact that we're still in the very early stages of even deploying the technology to being able to get that sort of, right. You have to get to a certain economy of scale for this to really have an impact. And the third, and this is probably the most important, is that in the end, I don't think we're ever going to see these breakthrough numbers, transformationally, until we start redesigning work around these AI empowered workflows. And so that's, honestly, I don't know if I know any organization that's really in earnest doing any of that, right? There's still a lot of experimentation going on. So, I neither found, and I think this was sort of your point when, in the quote you gave, I neither found this surprising, nor did I find it horribly disquieting, right? I mean, I found it not to be unexpected, and I think this is a pretty normal sort of stage of where we're at. The one thing I would take from it, though, is that if you are a CIO, if you're selling this internally, you need to moderate the hype. You need to moderate the expectations as to what is really going to happen and what we can realistically expect from the technology to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think this eliminates the potential for AI to be more productive in the future, but I think it's interesting how we're starting to realize how there's a sandwich of capabilities, or like multiple layers of capabilities necessary to translate AI into true productivity. Because you've got the model layer itself, you need some sort of business context layer in the middle, and then you've got these outputs that also still need to be shaped and guided to some extent. So it's not simply a matter of I put stuff in the model and the model's so smart that it gives me something fantastic in return, no matter how big and how smart the model is.
Well, and we didn't pick it up. I mean, I think this has been happening the last couple of weeks, but we had in recent weeks we had both Shopify and Duolingo made separate announcements about either not hiring new workers. I think
Mhm.
Duolingo was not hiring any contractors until you could prove that
Yep.
AI couldn't do the work. And I struggle with these announcements because it's like there's not a single AI tool that I've seen that is capable of completely replacing an entire human-driven workflow, period, where I could just like, oh, I'm not going to hire Joe the contractor. I'm going to bring this AI in. I'm going to ask it to do
Mhm.
everything else. Literally, nothing can do that today. So I don't understand, other than get some in the news. I don't really understand what they're hoping to accomplish, and it's either they're just delirious on the hype, or they're just being cynical and making these grandiose statements, knowing that they are not achievable. I'm not
Yeah.
sure which, but
Right. Like I see these announcements by, say, Satya Nadella or Mark Zuckerberg saying 20 or 30% of our code is now written by AI. And I'm thinking either you don't understand what's going on or you're putting out some pretty substandard code. Like, like I
yeah, it's just
understand
that
that you can get little applets, you can get 20, 30 decent lines of code to do one specific thing from AI because it is copying from Stack Overflow, basically. And I understand that, but you're not going to get an app out of AI. And you're not even going to be able to put it in the right place without a developer to decide where that code goes.
Yeah, well, and I think that is the key thing is that even if I could get it to give me a full app, what is clearly not existing today is something that's going to take it cradle to grave and actually put it into a deployable state and deploy it into a production environment and do all the
And
components that are
test
necessary.
and yeah.
Right. Yeah, I may have different AI that can help with different parts of this, but it's not going to be. And this is, we've talked a lot about this idea of agentic management of integration of multiple agents, and this is why all this is important, because eventually that's what happens, right? We're going to have specific agents, one that's really good at the coding, one that's really good at deployment in this scenario, right? And it's this whole host of agents, and then they all have to be orchestrated. And all of that is very complex, and it's super complex when you talk about the fact that that's a high risk workflow, because if it fails, now I'm potentially putting a whole lot of business at risk. And so, that's the challenge with all of the hype around all of this. And that leads us to the last meaty article that we want to talk about, and that is this one's from CIO.com. And it's basically talking about the one of the roots of everything we just talked about being a challenge is the fact that we sort of right there in the mix of all that talked about agents and AI and generative AI, and sort of we're doing it ourselves, just sort of mix and matching these terms a little bit. And this is one of the issues, that there is still not a common accepted definition of what an agent, an AI agent even is. And this article points out that in addition to the legitimate lack of a consistent definition, there's also a whole bunch of folks out there that aren't even trying. They're just simply taking automation or maybe a simple algorithm and slapping the phrase agentic AI on it in the hopes that it gets them someplace. And so it's certainly, I think, as a CIO, and the whole point of this article is that it creates risk and challenges for a CIO, because these hype is blurring these lines of being able to sort it all out. And so I don't know. I mean, I feel, if anything, I feel like it's getting worse. And like your experience at RSA last week sort of, solidifies that. Like, I think the problem, because this has become so hyped up, that it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yes. And we're right now struggling to figure out whether an agent is simply an algorithm that can take a single action, or whether it is a chatbot, or whether it is the use of a model, or whether the model is interacting with another system, whether the agent is actually making some sort of decision, whether the agent is taking multiple workflows and linking them together through some sort of memory or some sort of attention, and whether those agents, can an agent talk to another agent, and can those two agents work independently together on any sort of work. This right over here is where all the promises are being made, and over here with the chatbots is where a lot of this stuff actually is right now. It's the user interface associated with an agent, but not necessarily the backend logic and decision making capabilities.
So, I have a very simple definition of it. I'm curious if, and feel free, I'd be really fascinated, feel free to shoot holes in this, but my definition is very simple. I look at this and say that if I think of this in terms of we had generative AI and now we have this idea of agentic AI, right? What is the step between those two?
Mhm.
Generative AI was just that. It generates a response. It is simply a conversation. It gives you information. It may be able to pull that information through a RAG system, but its job is to do one thing, and that is to answer the question that you asked it and give you information. To me, an agentic AI solution simply takes that to the next level of being able to take action. And one of the things that this article points out, and I actually disagreed with, is that the agent is all about autonomy. And I'm going to use the term very literally, right? Think for those of you not old like me, we used to have something called travel agents. When we needed to book travel, we couldn't just do it like we do now or go online and book it. We had to call somebody who booked travel for us. And I think that idea of a travel agent is actually a pretty good model for at least how we think of agents today, because that agent didn't operate autonomously, not in the way that some people I think are imagining AI, right? They didn't somehow magically figure out that I wanted to take a trip to Tahiti and just chose the hotel for me, booked my flights, and all of a sudden send me an email saying, here it is. No, there's a conversation, right? And I'd say, hey, I want to book a trip to Tahiti. And they'd say, great. For how many people? When? Do you, what level? How much money do you want to spend? Like all these questions would then go out, do some research, say, hey, this is what I found. Does this look good? Yeah, that's what I want. Great. Let me book the tickets for you, right? That sort of interaction is where I think how we should be thinking about agents right now. That I'm not sure if I would consider any of that quote unquote autonomous in the way that a lot of people refer to it. They're taking action, and they're taking that action autonomously insofar as I'm not pushing the button, but they're doing it based on my explicit direction, right? They're acting on my behalf. They're simplifying the process for me. They're employing a whole bunch of knowledge that I don't have, what all the resorts are, what the best time of year to go, oh, don't go to that one. They have a bed bug infestation, all that kind of stuff that maybe I don't know, right? That's how I think of an agent today, right? Of interacting and potentially also having this layer, and this would be the autonomous piece of, oh, they notice that a hurricane just came through and I'm already there. And the agent is saying, I'm going to rebook those flights for you because I know that you're going to be gone, right? So yes, that's a degree of autonomy within a very constrained sort of set of parameters. That's how I think that an agent makes sense today. And it's not that complicated. I mean, I'm not going to say that that's what I just explained is actually very hard to do, but I'm saying I think all these debates sometimes overcomplicate the fact of how we as humans would want to interact with someone that we might call in a human world an agent. I think we should be thinking about AI agents the exact same way.
Yeah, I think actually that chain of thought and the intermediate interruptions are an important piece of the puzzle, because if you simply ask a question and then it tries to work through the entire problem and never assumes that it might be missing important information, that's not really agentic in the way that we're being sold it as, because we think of agentic as something that is eventually over time able to take over the tier one work, the most basic work that we do. And you can't do that without interacting with the person who is making a request. Even if you are asking the most basic help desk ticket, you are typically going back and forth with the person who asked at least once to make sure that you're going in the right direction, or to clarify some information, or because they asked the question poorly, not their fault. They're not the subject matter expert, you are. So there's that type of back and forth, and understanding that the information that you've received is not sufficient. And I feel like anything that drives straight through to completion every single time lacks that intelligent capability.
Well, and here's what's interesting about the scenario I just painted, right? So let's say travel agents still, and I know they do sort of, but for the most part, let's just say they were ubiquitous, right? Most organizations had them. Mm-hmm. The scenario I just described, so I just gave it from the consumer end of it, the person interacting with that travel agent. But now let's flip it upside down. And from the organization side, well, that agent I've just deployed as my travel agent, AI travel agent, is in fact acting autonomously from the standpoint is they're not going back to their human counterpart on the back end and saying, hey, how do I do this? Or, hey, is this okay? Right? They're in that regard acting autonomously. And so this is where I think the confusion of the term can come from, because I can in fact deploy that agent, and that agent can interact with my customers or my employees and is acting autonomously from my standpoint, but not from the user standpoint. Right. And that is a really, really critical distinction about understanding how we start thinking about this technology and where we apply it. So, I think it's an ongoing challenge. And to your point, then that opens up this whole other can of worms. And that is, do I then have second tier agents? Is that front end agent interacting with back end agents to handle things? Do I have a security agent sitting there monitoring it? Hey, you can't book that trip. This looks like a fraudulent charge, right? And that becomes that whole sort of thing. But yeah, it's quite an interesting space, and I think that people are still really struggling to sort of get their head around it, and even to figure out which way is up.
Yep, there's a lot of room for impersonation there.
What a great setup to our closing story. So we always try to end on something light and fluffy and just a little bit more fun. And this one is actually from last week, but thankfully you and Ken didn't cover it, so I had the opportunity to bring it forward, and I just thought this was hilarious. So there is a radio station in Australia. I'm not sure where in Australia, maybe in Sydney. In either case, somewhere in Australia. Yeah, Sydney. And first of all, the big news is there's still radio stations apparently, like with broadcast shows and all that, which, I stream everything, so I didn't know that. But anyway, there's this radio station in Australia that has a 4-hour segment, a show that is called Workdays with Thigh, that plays a mix of hip hop, R&B, and pop with this host Thigh, as you might imagine. And it has been airing for months, apparently, and it is entirely AI. The host is AI. The selection of the songs, I believe, are AI, and nobody figured it out. And I actually listened to a couple of the samples, and I got to tell you, it was pretty remarkable. I think for many of us, we just sort of have radio in the background anyway. I'm not scrutinizing it. If I wasn't actually scrutinizing, if I didn't have a reason to pay attention to it, at least in the snippets that I heard, I never would have thought twice. It was pretty amazing. And this is an example of where it's like, oh yeah, we can absolutely see this sort of impersonation. Is this? I mean, I'm not sure how much money they're saving. They're saving one host, but it quite interesting. Probably the last thing that I found interesting is there didn't seem to be a lot of uproar over this. When the news got out, it was newsworthy. But what I haven't seen in any of the reporting is that people are like, oh my, and it's not like the Reddit, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we got manipulated here, that we were listening to an AI DJ. It's like no one seems to care on this one. So it is interesting, the difference in perspectives.
Well, to be fair, who really cares about radio stations anymore? But that painful note aside, I'm also taking some notes here, figuring out how do I set this up so we can just set up our AI avatars to do this podcast going forward. The technology is really amazing. Like when we have played with, say, Notebook LM, like, an outstanding product that Google's made, at least as long as it lasts. But the ability to create voices and focusing them on the topic and letting them talk, they can be really good as long as they are fed the right direction.
So here, that would be a great little test. Maybe we should take one of our podcasts as I don't know if we can do this in Notebook LM, but it would be fun to like feed one of these in as an example, and then give it our normal, because the way the sausage is made is Hyoun and I go through and we collect a series of articles and we weed out and say these are the 8 or 10 or whatever we're going to talk about. We could feed it those articles, say here's an example of the type of conversations we have in the analysis provide. Here's our audience. And let Notebook LM go and generate a podcast for us. So who knows? Maybe we don't need to do this anymore.
Yes, we can just be the curators and the puppet masters behind the screen.
Well, I guess we will see. It's an interesting world that is changing all the time, and it's a fun time to be in the middle of all of it.
Extremely fast. I know it's why I'm so excited to get back in the games, right? It's like there's so much happening right now you know, you get to build it, and I'm just just sitting back here watching.
Lots going on. Definitely lots going on.
On that note, thank you so much for joining us for another week of This Week in Enterprise Tech. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, comment, and let us know what you thought. And we'll see you next week.